January in Everpine, Washington. Snow drifted onto the courthouse steps as 18-year-old Marissa Jenkins entered with pink gloves and a perfect posture. To half the journalists outside, she was a young woman caught in a nightmare. To the other half, she was the nightmare. For Marissa, this wasn't justice. It was performance art, a stage to control how the world saw her. Charged with killing her stepfather, she told cameras it was self-defense, that the man made her life a prison. The jury pitied her. Even the psychologists seemed uncertain. She spoke about fear with rehearsed trembles and tilted eyes. But the truth wasn't in her testimony. It was on a camera lens no one realized had been watching. A single recording would destroy everything, every tear, every lie, every crafted tremor. It would reveal that she didn't act in self-defense at all. She acted in pride. By the time the judge spoke her name for the last time, the snow would still fall, but the act would be over, leaving nothing on her stage but silence. The arraignment took place on a Thursday morning when frost still clung to the windows of Everpine County's Superior Court. Marissa Jenkins sat at the defense table in an orange jumpsuit with a white undershirt beneath, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her attorney, Malcolm Brenner, a silver-haired man with 30 years of criminal defense experience, leaned close and whispered instructions she pretended to absorb. She nodded at the appropriate moments. Her eyes, however, drifted to the gallery, where her mother sat weeping into a tissue, flanked by two family friends who placed consoling hands on her shoulders. Marissa allowed a single tear to trace down her own cheek. She timed it perfectly. Just as the judge entered, just as the court reporter glanced her way, just as the sketch artist's pencil hovered over paper. Judge Victoria Landers took her seat with the practiced grace of someone who had presided over hundreds of cases. She was a black woman in her early 50s, her hair pulled back in a tight bun, her expression neutral but penetrating. She looked at Marissa for a long moment before addressing the courtroom. The charges were read aloud. Murder in the first degree. The defendant had shot and killed her stepfather, Richard Jenkins, in their family home on the evening of December 3rd. The prosecution alleged premeditation. The defense claimed self-defense against an abusive authority figure. Marissa entered her plea in a voice barely above a whisper. Not guilty. She squeezed her mother's hand theatrically when they made eye contact across the room, and whispered just loud enough for the nearby microphones to catch. I'm scared. The bailiff called for order as cameras clicked. At the prosecution table, Clive Reyes sat perfectly still. He was a man in his 40s, with close-cropped hair and a reputation for thoroughness that bordered on obsession. His co-counsel, a younger woman named Dana Ortiz, shuffled papers beside him, but Reyes never looked down. He watched Marissa. He watched the way she angled her face toward the press section. He watched the precise timing of her tears. When the hearing concluded and the judge set a trial date, Reyes leaned over the table and said quietly to Ortiz, "We'll show she wasn't terrified. She was in control." The days leading up to trial were a blur of media coverage. Marissa gave one interview to a local news station, her voice soft and halting, describing a household filled with tension and fear. She claimed Richard Jenkins had controlled every aspect of her life, monitored her phone, restricted her freedom, made her feel like a prisoner. The interviewer, a sympathetic woman in her 30s, asked gently if she had ever felt her life was in danger. Marissa paused, bit her lower lip, then nodded. "Every day," she said. every single day. The clip went viral. Advocacy groups for domestic violence survivors sent letters of support. A defense fund was established. Marissa watched it all from her cell, a faint smile playing at the corners of her mouth when no guards were looking. Detective Laura Rowe had been the first responder on the scene the night of the shooting. She was a veteran investigator, 14 years with the Everpine County Sheriff's Office, and she had seen enough crime scenes to trust her instincts. When she arrived at the Jenkins home that December night, the front door was open. Snow blew into the foyer. She found Richard Jenkins in the living room, slumped against the couch, a single gunshot wound to the chest. Marissa sat on the stairs, her hands in her lap, her expression curiously blank. Rowe had approached slowly, calling out to identify herself. Marissa looked up. "He attacked me," she said. "I had to protect myself." Her voice was calm, too calm. Rowe made note of it in her report. She photographed the scene, collected the firearm, a 9mm handgun registered to Richard Jenkins, and called for backup. Marissa was taken into custody without resistance. On the drive to the station, Rowe watched her in the rear-view mirror. The young woman stared out the window, her breathing steady, her face composed. Most people in shock trembled or cried, or fell silent in a different way, a hollow way. Marissa seemed almost serene. The trial began on a grey Monday in late January. The courtroom was packed. Journalists filled the back rows. Sketch artists positioned themselves for clear sightlines. The jury, 7 women and 5 men, took their seats and regarded Marissa with expressions ranging from curiosity to sympathy. She wore a soft grey sweater over her jumpsuit, a concession her attorney had negotiated with the court. Her hair was pulled into a neat ponytail. She looked young, vulnerable, exactly as Brenner had coached her. The prosecution's opening statement was delivered by Clive Reyes. He stood before the jury and spoke in measured tones. He told them they would hear a story about control, about calculation, about a young woman who believed she could manipulate the system. He told them about the evidence they would see, the forensic analysis, the digital records, the testimony of those who knew Marissa best. And he told them about the video. A recording that would show them the truth of what happened in that living room. He didn't elaborate. He wanted them curious, hungry for it. When he sat down, he saw Marissa whispering to Brenner, her brow furrowed in what looked like concern. But her eyes, Reyes noted, flickered toward the jury to gauge their reaction. Brenner's opening was a study in emotional appeal. He spoke of a young woman trapped in an impossible situation, living under the thumb of a controlling stepfather who dictated her every move. He painted Richard Jenkins as a tyrant, a man who used his authority to crush Marissa's spirit. He told the jury that what they would see was not murder, but survival. A frightened young woman who had no choice but to defend herself. He gestured toward Marissa, who dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. The jury watched her. Some nodded slightly. Reyes made a note on his legal pad. The performance had begun. The first witness for the prosecution was Detective Rowe. She took the stand and was sworn in. Reyes walked her through the night of the shooting, asking her to describe the scene in detail. Rowe spoke clearly, consulting her notes. The victim was found in the living room. The wound was to the upper chest,
consistent with a shot fired from several feet away. The angle suggested the shooter had been standing while the victim was seated or kneeling. Marissa had been calm, cooperative, and had immediately claimed self-defense. The firearm was recovered near the defendant's feet. Gunshot residue tests confirmed she had fired the weapon. Brenner's cross-examination focused on Marissa's demeanor. Wasn't it possible, he asked, that her calmness was a result of shock? Wasn't it common for trauma survivors to dissociate, to appear detached? Rowe conceded that trauma responses varied, but when Brenner pressed further, suggesting that Marissa's composure indicated she was a victim in survival mode, Rowe hesitated. "In my experience," she said,
"someone in genuine fear shows it. They shake, they cry, they can barely speak." This defendant was articulate and precise in her account. She knew exactly what she was saying. Brenner objected. The judge sustained it. But the point had been made. The next witness was a former teacher from Marissa's high school. Janet Colby had taught her English during her junior year. She testified that Marissa was a bright student, exceptionally intelligent, but had often seemed withdrawn. She mentioned that Marissa once stayed after class to talk about stress at home, though she hadn't provided specifics. Brenner seized on this during his questioning. "So she confided in you about difficulties at home," he said. "Yes," Colby replied. "And did she seem afraid?" Colby paused. "She seemed," she began, and then reconsidered her words. "She seemed careful, like she was choosing what to say." Brenner nodded as if satisfied, but Reyes saw the ambiguity in the answer. On redirect, he asked Colby to clarify. "What do you mean by careful?" Colby shifted in her seat. "She seemed to be testing how I would react," she said, like she was performing for an audience. The testimony that began to shift the trial came from the medical examiner. Dr. Raymond Suther took the stand and presented the autopsy findings. Richard Jenkins had died from a single gunshot wound to the chest. The bullet had pierced his heart. The trajectory, however, told a story. The angle of entry was downward, suggesting the shooter had been standing while the victim was at a lower position. The wound also showed stippling, indicating the gun had been fired from a distance of 3 to 5 feet. Not contact range, not close struggle range. Reyes asked the doctor to explain what this meant. "It means," Dr. Suther said, "that the victim was not engaged in close physical combat with the shooter at the time of the shot. He was at a distance, likely seated or kneeling, when the bullet struck." Brenner attempted to reframe this during cross-examination. Couldn't the victim have been advancing toward her, forcing her to back away and fire? Dr. Suther considered this. "It's possible," he said, "but unlikely, given the positioning of the body. The victim fell backward against the couch, suggesting he was already in a stationary or retreating position when shot." Brenner pressed. "But you can't say with certainty that he wasn't a threat." Dr. Suther met his eyes. "I can say with certainty that the physical evidence does not support a close-range struggle." The jury took notes. Marissa's expression remained neutral, but her hands tightened in her lap. The prosecution then introduced the ballistics evidence. A firearms examiner named Keith Vargas explained the analysis of the 9mm handgun recovered from the scene. He walked the jury through the process of test-firing the weapon, comparing the striations on the recovered bullet to those from the test rounds. The match was conclusive. This weapon fired the fatal shot. He also discussed the gunshot residue found on Marissa's hands. The pattern was consistent with someone who had discharged a firearm. Both hands showed residue, indicating a two-handed grip, a stable, controlled grip, not the frantic grab of someone in panic. Reyes let that detail hang in the air. Brenner's cross-examination focused on whether the residue could have transferred from simply handling the gun after the shooting. Vargas acknowledged it was possible, but unlikely, given the concentration and distribution of particles. The pattern suggested active firing, not passive contact. Brenner tried another angle. Is it possible that someone firing in self-defense would use a two-handed grip? Vargas nodded. Yes, if they had any training or instinct for accuracy. So this doesn't prove intent, Brenner said. Vargas replied, it proves control. Whether that control indicates intent is for the jury to decide. During a recess, Reyes and Ortiz reviewed their notes in a small conference room adjacent to the courtroom. Ortiz sipped cold coffee and said, "The ballistics are solid, but Brenner's doing a decent job muddying the waters." Reyes nodded. "He's good, but he's working with a bad client." Ortiz raised an eyebrow. "You think the jury sees through her?" Reyes leaned back in his chair. "Some of them do. Watch Juror 7, the older man in the back row. Every time Marissa dabs her eyes, he frowns. He's not buying it." Ortiz smiled. "Then we just need to give the rest of them a reason to stop buying it too." Reyes tapped the folder in front of him. The digital evidence would do that. But they had to build to it carefully. They had to let the defense think they still had a chance. The trial resumed with testimony from Marissa's best friend, a young woman named Ashley Torres. She took the stand reluctantly, avoiding eye contact with Marissa. Reyes approached her gently. He asked her to describe her friendship with the defendant. Ashley said they had been close since middle school, spent almost every day together, shared everything. Reyes asked if Marissa had ever mentioned her stepfather. Ashley nodded. She talked about him a lot. She said he was strict, that he didn't let her do what she wanted. "Did she ever say she was afraid of him?" Reyes asked. Ashley hesitated. "Not exactly. She said he was annoying, that he got in her way." Reyes asked her to elaborate. Ashley took a breath. "About a week before it happened, Marissa told me she had a plan. She said Richard was going to send her to boarding school because he found out she'd been stealing from his wallet. She was furious. She said he was trying to ruin her life. And then she said, 'He'll regret crossing me.'" The courtroom went silent. Brenner stood immediately. "Objection, hearsay." Judge Landers looked at Reyes. "Your response?" Reyes said, "It's being offered not for the truth of the matter asserted, but to show the defendant's state of mind." The judge overruled the objection. Ashley continued. She described how Marissa had talked about different scenarios, different ways to make Richard look bad. She mentioned staging bruises, recording arguments, making it seem like he was abusive. Ashley said she thought Marissa was just venting, blowing off steam. But then, Richard was dead, and Ashley realized her friend had been serious. Brenner's cross-examination was aggressive. He suggested that Ashley was lying to protect herself, that she was turning on Marissa to avoid being implicated. Ashley shook her head. "I'm here because I don't want to lie anymore." Brenner asked if she had any proof of these conversations. Ashley said no. They had been in person or over phone calls. Nothing in writing. Brenner pounced. "So we're supposed to take your word for it?" Ashley met his gaze. "Yes, because it's the truth." Brenner dismissed her.
But the damage was done. The jury had heard the threat. The prosecution's next witness was a digital forensics expert named Marcus Chen. He had analyzed Marissa's laptop and smartphone, both of which had been seized during the investigation. Chen testified that he had recovered the browsing history from the weeks leading up to the shooting. The searches were damning. How to fake bruises. How to make someone look abusive. Self-defense laws in Washington. Minimum sentence for manslaughter. The list went on. Reyes asked Chen to explain the significance. "These searches indicate premeditation," Chen said.
The defendant was researching how to create a false narrative of abuse and how to minimize legal consequences. Brenner objected, arguing that internet searches were not proof of intent. Judge Landers allowed the testimony, but instructed the jury to weigh it appropriately. During cross-examination, Brenner suggested that Marissa could have been researching out of fear, trying to understand her legal options if she ever had to defend herself. Chen didn't waver. The timing and specificity of the searches suggest planning, not fear. Someone afraid for their life doesn't Google minimum sentences. They call the police. Chen also testified about deleted text messages he had recovered. One exchange stood out. Marissa had texted a friend, "If he sends me away, I swear I'll make him sorry." The friend had replied, asking if she was serious. Marissa wrote back, "Watch me." The texts were dated 5 days before the shooting. Brenner tried to characterize them as teenage hyperbole, but the jury's expressions suggested they were unconvinced. As the trial progressed, Marissa's mask began to show cracks. During Ashley's testimony, she had stiffened visibly. When the text messages were read aloud, her jaw tightened. She whispered urgently to Brenner during breaks, gesturing sharply. Observers in the gallery noted that her carefully cultivated fragility seemed to slip. She stopped crying. Her eyes, instead of soft and wounded, grew sharp and calculating. The sketch artist captured it, the shift from victim to something else. The prosecution called a forensic psychologist, Dr. Nina Patel, who had evaluated Marissa after her arrest. Dr. Patel testified that Marissa's cognitive abilities were well above average. She had scored in the 98th percentile on comprehension and reasoning tests. She understood complex moral and legal concepts. She knew right from wrong. She was fully capable of understanding the consequences of her actions. Reyes asked if trauma could have impaired her judgment. Dr. Patel said that while trauma could affect decision-making, there was no evidence that Marissa was suffering from acute psychological distress at the time of the shooting. In fact, her responses during the evaluation suggested a high degree of self-awareness and control. Brenner challenged the assessment. He brought in his own expert, Dr. Alan Frost, who testified that young adults could experience dissociative states under extreme stress, leading them to act without full conscious awareness. He suggested that Marissa might have been in such a state when she fired the gun. But on cross-examination, Reyes dismantled the theory. He asked Dr. Frost if dissociative states typically involved meticulous planning, strategic internet searches, and calculated conversations with friends. Dr. Frost admitted that would be unusual. Reyes pressed further. And would someone in a dissociative state have the presence of mind to immediately claim self-defense and construct a coherent narrative? Dr. Frost conceded it was unlikely. The trial had stretched into its third week when Reyes stood to introduce the piece of evidence he had been building toward. He announced to the court that the prosecution had recovered supplementary footage from a nanny cam system installed in the Jenkins home. The camera had been positioned in the living room, ostensibly to monitor the family dog while the adults were at work. It had been recording on the night of the shooting. Marissa's reaction was immediate. Her face went pale. She leaned toward Brenner and whispered urgently, "They can't use that." Brenner placed a hand on her arm, trying to calm her, but she pulled away. Her composure, so carefully maintained, wavered. Brenner requested a sidebar. At the bench, he argued that the footage had not been disclosed during discovery. Reyes explained that the nanny cam system had been cloud-based and the relevant files had only been recovered recently after a subpoena to the service provider. The delay was unavoidable. Judge Landers reviewed the documentation and ruled that the evidence was admissible. Brenner returned to the defense table, his expression grim. Marissa stared at him, her eyes wide. "What do we do?" she hissed. He told her to stay calm, but he knew what was coming. The next day, the courtroom was more crowded than ever. Word had spread that critical evidence was about to be presented. Reyes called his final witness, a digital authentication expert named Gerald Sims. Sims testified about the process of recovering and verifying the nanny cam footage. He explained the chain of custody, the metadata analysis, the timestamps. Everything confirmed that the video was unedited and authentic. It had been recorded on December 3rd at approximately 8:15 in the evening, the exact time of the shooting. Brenner cross-examined, looking for any flaw in the authentication process. He found none. Sims had been thorough. The video was real. Reyes stood. "Your Honor, the state moves to introduce Exhibit 47. The judge nodded. The bailiff dimmed the lights. A large screen was positioned so that the jury, the judge, and the gallery could all see. Marissa sat frozen. Her hands gripped the edge of the table. Reyes pressed play. The footage was grainy but clear enough. The living room came into view. Richard Jenkins was visible, standing near the couch. He looked tired, his shoulders slumped. He was speaking, though the audio was faint at first. Then Marissa entered the frame. She was holding the gun. Richard's hands came up immediately, palms out. Whoa, Marissa, let's talk about this." His voice was pleading, not aggressive. "Put the gun down, sweetheart. We can work this out." Marissa didn't respond. She stepped closer, the gun steady in her hands. Richard backed toward the couch. "I know you're upset about the school thing," he said. "We can discuss it. You don't have to do this." Marissa's expression on the video was calm, almost serene. She tilted her head slightly. Then she spoke, her voice clear on the recording. "Now they'll finally believe me." Richard's eyes widened. "What?" Marissa raised the gun, her stance controlled, her grip firm. She aimed at his chest. Richard dropped to his knees, hands still raised. "Please," he said. "Please don't." Marissa didn't hesitate. She pulled the trigger. The sound of the gunshot was sharp, startling even through the courtroom speakers. Richard fell back against the couch, clutching his chest. Marissa stood over him for a moment, watching. Then she set the gun down carefully, took out her phone, and dialed 911. Her voice, when she spoke to the dispatcher, was shaking, hysterical, nothing like the cold tone she had used moments before. "He attacked me," she sobbed into the phone. "I had to shoot him. Oh my God, I had to shoot him." The video ended.
The courtroom was silent. No one moved. Reyes let the moment stretch, let the weight of what they had just witnessed settle over the room. Then he looked at the jury. "That," he said quietly, "is the truth. Not the story she told you, not the performance she put on. That is what happened." Marissa sat utterly still. The color had drained from her face. Her hands were shaking, not in the rehearsed way she had trembled for the cameras, but in genuine shock. One tear slid down her cheek, and for the first time, it seemed real. Not from guilt, but from the horror of being seen, of being caught. Her mask had shattered. Brenner sat beside her, his expression one of quiet defeat. There was nothing he could say. The video spoke for itself. In the gallery, Marissa's mother wept uncontrollably, her body shaking with sobs. The family friends who had supported her throughout the trial looked stunned. Some of the jurors had tears in their eyes. Others looked angry. Juror 7, the older man Reyes had noted, stared at Marissa with open disgust. Judge Landers called for a brief recess. The jury filed out in silence. Marissa was led back to the holding cell, her legs unsteady. Brenner followed, knowing he had to prepare her for what came next, though there was little preparation that could help now. When the trial resumed, Brenner made a last effort. He called Marissa to the stand. It was a desperate move, but he had no choice. Marissa took the oath, her voice barely audible. Brenner asked her to explain what had happened that night. She spoke haltingly, describing fear, desperation, a moment of panic. She claimed that Richard had been threatening, that his words on the video didn't capture the full context. But Reyes's cross-examination was merciless. He played the video again, pausing at key moments. He asked Marissa to explain her smirk. She said it wasn't a smirk. She had been terrified. He asked her to explain her words. "Now they'll finally believe me." She stammered, saying she meant they would believe she had been afraid. Reyes pressed. "You researched how to fake abuse. You told your friend you would make Richard sorry. You planned this." Marissa denied it, but her voice lacked conviction. Reyes asked her about the phone call to 911, the sudden shift in tone. She said she had been in shock. He asked why she had been so calm immediately after the shooting, so composed when police arrived. She said she didn't remember. Reyes let the inconsistencies pile up. By the time he was finished, Marissa's testimony had only made things worse. Closing arguments were brief. Brenner did his best, appealing to the jury's sympathy, suggesting that the video didn't show the full story, that Marissa was still a victim of circumstance. But his heart wasn't in it. Reyes's closing was simple and devastating. He walked the jury through the evidence, piece by piece. The planning, the searches, the texts, the forensics, and finally, the video. He told them that Marissa Jenkins was not a frightened girl acting in self-defense. She was a calculating individual who had committed murder and tried to manipulate the system. He asked them to hold her accountable. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. When they returned, their faces were somber. The foreperson stood and delivered the verdict. Guilty of murder in the first degree. Marissa closed her eyes. Her mother cried out from the gallery. Brenner placed a hand on Marissa's shoulder, but she didn't seem to notice. Sentencing was scheduled for the following week. When that day arrived, the courtroom was once again full. Marissa sat in her orange jumpsuit, her hair disheveled, her eyes red. She had stopped performing. There was no audience left to convince. Before the judge delivered the sentence, the victim's family was given the opportunity to speak. Richard Jenkins's brother, Michael, took the stand. He spoke about Richard, about the man he had been, a good father, a devoted husband to Marissa's mother, someone who had tried to provide structure and guidance. He looked at Marissa and said, "You took him from us because you didn't get your way, because he dared to set boundaries. He tried to love you, and you saw that as control. You didn't see a father figure. You saw an obstacle, and you removed him." Marissa stared at the floor. She didn't react. The performance was over. There was only silence now, and the weight of what she had done. Judge Landers addressed the court. She looked at Marissa for a long moment before she began to speak. Her voice was measured but firm, each word deliberate. "Miss Jenkins," she said, "over the course of this trial, this court has watched your performance. And make no mistake, it was a performance. From the moment you walked into this courtroom, you have attempted to manipulate every person in this room. You performed fragility. You performed fear. You performed the role of a victim with remarkable skill. You squeezed your mother's hand for the cameras. You timed your tears for maximum effect. You tilted your head, widened your eyes, and spoke in soft tones designed to invoke sympathy. You treated this courtroom as a stage, and you believed, with absolute certainty, that you would receive a standing ovation. But the camera you didn't know was watching, the one you never accounted for, has shown us the truth. It revealed what you truly are. Not a frightened girl acting in desperation, not a victim pushed beyond her limits. You are a deliberate, informed, and ruthless individual who planned a murder and executed it with chilling precision. The evidence presented in this case is overwhelming. You researched how to fabricate abuse. You discussed your plans with your friends. You made threats. And when the moment came, you did not act in fear. You acted with cold calculation. The video shows us a man on his knees, begging for his life. It shows us you, standing over him, calm and controlled. And it captures your words. "Now they'll finally believe me." Those words tell us everything. You were not defending yourself. You were setting the stage for your defense. You were already planning your performance before you pulled the trigger. Richard Jenkins was not a perfect man. No one is. But he did not deserve to die. He certainly did not deserve to be murdered by someone he had tried to help, tried to guide, tried to love as a daughter. And yet you took his life, not because you had to, but because you wanted to. Because he stood in the way of what you wanted. Because he dared to hold you accountable. What disturbs this court most, Miss Jenkins, is not just the act itself, but the aftermath. You called 911 and performed hysteria. You spoke to investigators and performed confusion. You sat in this courtroom and performed innocence. You manipulated your own mother, who even now struggles to reconcile the daughter she thought she knew
with the person you have revealed yourself to be. You exploited the goodwill of advocates and supporters who believed they were defending a survivor of abuse. You wasted the time and resources of this court, of the jury, of everyone involved in this process, because you believed you were clever enough to get away with it. But you were not clever enough. You were arrogant, and that arrogance led you to underestimate the very people you sought to deceive. You underestimated the investigators who meticulously gathered evidence. You underestimated the forensic experts who analyzed every detail. You underestimated the witnesses who, despite their personal connections to you, chose to tell the truth. And most of all, you underestimated that camera, silently recording, capturing the moment your mask slipped and the truth emerged. This court has considered the arguments presented by your attorney. He has asked for leniency, citing your age, your lack of prior criminal history, your potential for rehabilitation. And while this court acknowledges that you are young, youth does not excuse what you have done. The evidence shows that you possess a keen intellect. You scored in the 98th percentile on cognitive assessments. You understood the moral and legal implications of your actions. You knew that taking a life was wrong. You knew that murder carried severe consequences. And yet, you proceeded. Not out of ignorance, but out of arrogance. You believed you could outsmart the system. You believed you could craft a narrative so compelling that no one would question it. You were wrong. The law exists to protect society from individuals who pose a danger to others. It exists to ensure that those who commit heinous acts are held accountable. And it exists to send a message that certain behaviors will not be tolerated, regardless of the age or background of the perpetrator. You, Miss Jenkins, have demonstrated through your actions and your conduct that you are a danger. You have shown a willingness to kill to achieve your goals. You have shown a capacity for manipulation and deceit that is deeply troubling. And you have shown a complete lack of remorse for the life you took. Even now, as you sit in this courtroom, you do not appear to grasp the full weight of what you have done. You are not weeping for Richard Jenkins. You are not mourning the pain you have caused his family, or your own mother, or the community. You are, if anything, stunned that your performance failed. You are shocked that you were caught. That is not remorse. That is wounded pride. This court has a responsibility to ensure that justice is served, both for the victim and for society. And justice, in this case, demands a sentence that reflects the severity of your crime, the premeditation with which it was carried out, and the danger you pose. You took a life with full knowledge and intent. You attempted to evade responsibility through lies and manipulation, and you have shown no genuine insight into the harm you have caused. Therefore, it is the judgment of this court that you, Marissa Jenkins, be sentenced to 40 years to life in the custody of the Washington State Department of Corrections. You will be eligible for parole after serving 35 years. This sentence reflects the gravity of your crime and the need to protect society from individuals who commit premeditated murder. I want to be very clear with you, Miss Jenkins. You were not just a kid. You were not a confused or frightened child, acting on instinct. You were, and are, a person who understood exactly what you were doing. You made a choice. You chose to plan. You chose to deceive. You chose to kill. And now you must face the consequences of those choices. This court hopes that during your incarceration, you will find the insight and the humility that you have so clearly lacked. I hope that you will come to understand the enormity of what you have done. I hope that you will develop genuine remorse, not for being caught, but for the life you took and the lives you shattered. But whether or not that happens, you will serve your sentence, and Richard Jenkins's family will have the knowledge that justice, however imperfect, has been done. The judge's words hung in the air. Marissa's shoulders heaved. She whispered something, but it was inaudible. Her face was hidden behind her hands. For the first time since the trial began, she looked small. Not in the calculated, theatrical way she had performed for the cameras, but genuinely diminished. The weight of the sentence, the finality of it, seemed to crush her. The bailiff approached. Marissa was led to her feet. Her legs were unsteady. As she was escorted from the courtroom, she glanced back once at her mother. Her mother looked away. The family friends who had filled the gallery for weeks were gone. Marissa walked through the side door and disappeared from view. The courtroom slowly emptied. The journalists filed out, already drafting their stories. The jury members left quietly, their duty fulfilled. The victim's family remained for a moment, Michael Jenkins sitting with his head bowed, his hands clasped. Then they too stood and left. Judge Landers remained on the bench for a few moments, reviewing her notes. Then she rose and exited to her chambers. The court reporter packed her equipment. The bailiff secured the room. In the days that followed, the case dominated headlines. The nanny cam video was dissected on news programs. Legal analysts debated the implications of trying young adults for premeditated murder. Advocacy groups argued over the nuances of self-defense claims. Psychologists discussed the case in academic journals, using it as an example in discussions of personality disorders and moral development. Marissa Jenkins became a symbol. To some, she was evidence of a broken system that failed to protect young people from abusive situations. To others, she was proof that age did not excuse responsibility, that understanding and intent mattered more than years lived. The debates raged, but the facts remained unchanged. A man was dead. A young woman had killed him. And the truth, captured on video, had been laid bare for all to see. In the state correctional facility where Marissa began serving her sentence, she adapted quickly to the routines. She followed the rules, kept to herself, and avoided conflict. Some of the staff noted that she seemed intelligent, polite even. But there was a distance to her, a coldness that never quite thawed. In therapy sessions, she spoke about the case in detached terms, analyzing her own actions as if discussing a character in a story. The therapists noted a lack of emotional connection to the harm she had caused. Whether that would change over the years remained to be seen. The Jenkins family tried to rebuild. Marissa's mother moved away from Everpine, seeking anonymity in another state. She rarely spoke of her daughter, though those close to her said the grief was profound, layered with guilt and confusion. Richard's brother Michael became an advocate for victims' rights, speaking at events and pushing for stronger accountability measures in the justice system. He carried his brother's memory with him, refusing to let it be overshadowed by the spectacle of the trial. The courtroom where the trial took place returned to its regular schedule. Other cases cycled through. Other defendants sat at the tables. Other juries deliberated. But for those who had been present during the Jenkins trial, the memory lingered. The image of the video playing on the screen, the sound of the gunshot, the silence that followed, and most of all,
The moment when the mask had finally fallen, revealing the truth beneath. Justice, in the end, was not a clean or satisfying thing. It was messy, complicated, and incomplete. It could not bring Richard Jenkins back. It could not undo the trauma inflicted on his family. It could not erase the manipulation and deceit that had unfolded in that courtroom. But it could, at the very least, acknowledge what had happened. It could name the crime. It could hold the perpetrator accountable. And it could send a message that some performances, no matter how convincing, would not be enough to escape the consequences of deliberate and calculated murder. The last image anyone had of Marissa Jenkins in that courtroom was of her being led away, her hair disheveled, her eyes downcast, her hands cuffed. The pink gloves she had worn on the first day were gone. The careful posture was gone. The rehearsed tears were gone. What remained was the reality of a 40-year sentence and the long, silent years ahead. The stage had gone dark. The audience had left. And Marissa Jenkins, alone at last, would have only the truth for company.